Okay, starting week 2. First of all, just a bit of clarification as to the postmodern versus American romantic, I would say, conflict that you kind of briefly worked on last week to kick us off. Most of you did well with the idea that an American romantic, if you're of that ilk, you see truth. You see truth with a capital T. A postmodernist, truth is vague and slippery and relative. It can shift with the wind. Certainly, it can even with words, which we see a lot of this going today. That a word that was okay one day is not the next, because postmodernists see words as signs that change according to social constraints. The aspect that was a little more tricky, I think, and I commented on this, I think, on your work, tried to mention this, is how very different an American romantic and a postmodernist view history. Some of your definitions, and they were tricky definitions, and postmodernism is tricky. But one of them, the belief that direction, evolution, progression have ended in social history. The next definition, the lack of purpose and direction in historical change. The postmodern would be that which presents the unpresentable and presentation itself. No government by pre-established rules, no predetermined judgments. So you get this idea in postmodernism, which is most postmodernists, 99.99%, who really say they are postmodern thinkers, are also atheists. And they view history very differently. A postmodernist sees history as just moments in time without connection that really serve no clear purpose. An American romanticist, on the other hand, sees history as very much an unfolding story. That's back to the big word meta-narrative, a grand story, a grand narrative that's being developed by a someone with a capital S. So generally speaking, American romanticists believe that history is an unfolding of events to varying degrees under God's control. That a creator has some role in the unfolding of history. A postmodernist would certainly say otherwise. Your work on what is an American, well, you could pretty much pick any aspect or precept on that American Romantic page because Gravencourt kind of captured the early idea of American Romantic thought. Probably the most often referenced precept that he drove home is that of the individual. The individual making his or her own way in a new world without constraints. The idea of you get here and there's an American dream for you to, again, kind of with the grace of God, unfold. So that's kind of a little clarification on last week's work. Please don't hesitate to let me know if you have questions, because this is a lot to digest in a very short time. The title for this course is Faith, Freedom, and the Frontier. So what we're looking at this week is early notions of faith, which seems appropriate as we're heading into the Thanksgiving season, because the Puritans kind of kicked off the idea of this being a Christian nation, which I think I'm accurate in saying is for the first time really kind of under debate in this country. And we live in interesting times. You have a page on the Puritans that you will reference to do your discussion post, but I'm going to go over some of it and clarify a little bit. And the introductory quote, I think, is worth contemplating. Without some understanding of Puritanism, it may safely be said there is no understanding of America. because the Puritans were the early founders on these shores primarily, who came here not for fortune, but to establish a community, a civilization. They weren't, as previous explorers, thinking this was the land of gold that they were going to dig up and find and take back home to Europe. They were here to stay. A little background of the Puritans, maybe in order to help you kind of get them historically contextualized. The Western world. Now I teach another course. It's called Non-Western Literature. And in that course we look at literature and thought from India and China and Japan and the Middle East. I hope you take it. It's really interesting. But this course is Western. We're looking at Europe and the Americas, primarily this country. American Romanticism. The world, the Western world was Catholic since Constantine made Christianity the official religion way back when. And Catholicism, I think there's an important quote that we need to keep in mind constantly. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, when you have only one church and it has all the power, in this case the Catholic Church, it became rather corrupted, and sadly that's part of human nature. Well, there was one invention that really changed the world, many, but in this particular case, the printing press. Because prior to this invention, the only people who had access to the scriptures were the very educated monks, Catholic priests. Well, if you're a corrupt Catholic priest, if you have too much power, human nature, you kind of go bad. They began doing things that were not scriptural in order to make money. And one of those was the selling of indulgences, which meant, and I'm giving this a real short, hasty little picture here, that if John's grandfather had died, a priest would come up and say, if you'll pay me so much money, I will pray your father, Catholicism, out of purgatory into heaven. Done. And by the way, if you'll give me a little extra money, I'll pray for you right now so your time in purgatory won't this long. And it was a corrupt teaching. It made money. Human nature. Printing press. And then a German monk started studying the scriptures very thoroughly for himself. Martin Luther, in 1517, posted 95 reasons, a thesis, each one, 95 theses, developing scriptures that argued clearly that such selling of indulgences was false. He posted these on the door of Nuremberg Church, and the Protestant Reformation was born. By the time this bloodbath got done, and it went back and forth for years, Catholics, Protestants, particularly in England, where the repercussions for being either one or the other, depending on who was on the throne, ended in many deaths. Tragically, but Martin Luther gave birth to the first denomination, which was the Lutheran Church, Luther denomination, Protestantism. And, from there we went to many, many denominations. But the one to keep in mind for you with the study of Puritanism is that of Calvinism. And John Calvin was French. He wrote Institutes of Christian Religion, where he outlined his ideas, his theological beliefs. The acronym is TULIP, and I'm going to go through these again hastily. He believed in total depravity, humankind's sinful, unconditional election, that God chooses who he's going to save, and that is predetermined. Limited atonement. It's limited. God's atoning grace, if you are of Christian persuasion, Jesus died, per Calvin, only for those God decided to choose to be saved, okay? Um, irresistible grace. If you were chosen or are chosen of one of the elect, then you have no choice. You're conformed, elected to salvation. And perseverance of the elect. If you are one of the elect, you cannot fall away. And these precepts became the foundation of Puritan thought. Just a little commentary, and it's certainly on your page. But we didn't end, of course, with the Lutheran Church or the Calvinist thought that became actually foundation of the Presbyterian Church and the Puritans. We went on to the Anglican Church of England. That's a whole nother story when you get into Henry VIII, and his reason for separating from Catholicism was not so theological. He wanted an heir, a son on his throne. He needed divorces. So women's heads rolled and the Anglican Church was born. The Puritans, the term was first used in 1564, and the Puritans were a group of people in England who did not think, under the Henry VIII and his chopping heads off of his wives, that the Protestant Reformation went far enough. They thought the Anglican Church was still far too Catholic and too corrupted at that point in history. So they separated eventually. Puritans became separatists, so to speak, and they fled to Holland. Then they were persecuted there, and they fled to the New World, the American shores. Not America at that time, really. They arrived in Massachusetts Bay, off Mayflower on 1620. Then the separatists came over about a decade later. Yes, the Puritans had the first Thanksgiving in 1621 with the help of Native Americans, who at that time were friendly, and only about 50% of those on the Mayflower actually did survive. The Massachusetts Bay Colony under John Winthrop, 1630, fared no better. They had a difficult time. They did not give up and have been highly influential in establishing American thought, particularly American Romantic thought. So as you're reading about the Puritans this week, I want you to keep that connection in mind, how you see the Puritans connecting to those basics of American Romanticism. What did the Puritans believe doctrinally? Well, keep in mind, we're in the 1600s with the Puritans. 100 years before Cravecourt's What is an American Writings. So the Puritans kind of established a lot of this carryover thought that became American thought. I want to clarify that. What did they believe? Number one, individual responsibility. Catholic thought, and I'm not making any judgmental statement here if you're a Catholic, just the way it is. If you're Catholic, you go to the priest to confess. The priest forgives and tells you what to do, basically, to atone for that sin. You confess to the priest, who then goes up the chain of command to God. Actually, priest, archbishop, levels, Pope, God. Okay. The Puritans rejected that totally. They believed it is totally one-on-one, the individual and God. In their Puritan services, there were initially no priest leaders, of course. Someone would deliver a message, and others would pray and contribute thought. They believed, as did Calvin, in the total depravity of man. The first little line in Puritan readers in elementary school, in Adam's Fall, we sinned all. total depravity. They believed salvation was a gift to the elected. Saints were to be regarded as models of emulation, but not veneration. That means that in a Catholic church, you might see beautiful statues of the Virgin Mary or the disciples, Peter. Well, not in a Puritan church. They considered that idolatry. You were to study such people and emulate, copy their lives, but certainly in no way venerate or idolize such. They relied on the Bible only, absolutely no catechisms or prayer books or creeds. They saw religion as a most mindful pursuit, ever so serious. The head must be educated. Puritans established public education. They thought even, and this is extreme, going back to the 1600s, even girls, they thought, needed to be in school and learn to read. Why? Because that girl needed to know the scripture, because only she would be responsible when she stood before God for her actions. They much emphasized plain living and high thinking, not given to excess. However, they did believe in hard work. We call it, sometimes it's still used, the Puritan work ethic. And this gets really tricky, and it's very circular reasoning. But they kept their villages clean, their barns full. They worked hard. Why? The harder they worked, the more successful they were. They argued that was the blessings of God. Why did God bless them? Because they were the elect. They were chosen by God to come here to become the new Israelites, create a new Canaan, a new city on a hill that would be a beacon to all the world. And a lot of these phrases are still used, particularly in political speeches. The Puritans' ideas have certainly resonated in the American psyche. Now, they saw life as a constant war between flesh and the spirit. Some of their contributions, they created divinity schools, such as Harvard, which I don't know what these people that created these universities, Yale, would think of such today. As I mentioned, public education, a very enlightened and ordered political structure. They considered chaos devilish. They encouraged hard work, thrift, and capitalism. They believed in mass prosperity, and after time, their villages were quite prosperous. They saw America, as I mentioned, Salem, Massachusetts. Well, Salem comes from Jerusalem. They very much saw America as Jerusalem reborn, the final promised land. And certainly they have provided us with a lot of American literature and a lot of American thought. Okay, on to your readings for the week. A little background. You're going to be reading Mary Rawlinson's Captivity Narrative. And I mentioned that American Romanticism wanted to, one of the reasons it was born was to create an American body of literature separate from Europe. And certainly captivity narratives were something only the Americans could give birth to, because Americans were becoming prisoners, captured by the Native Americans as time went on. According to Richard Slocum, need some feedback for some reason. Let me shut this down. Okay, according to Richard Slocum, a captivity narrative is a single individual who stands passively under the strokes of evil, awaiting rescue by the grace of God. The sufferer represents the whole chastened body of Puritan society, and temporary bondage of the captive to the Indian is dual paradigm of the bondage of the soul to the flesh, the temptations arising from original sin. I'm going to stop this and start again since there's so much feedback.